Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one we start out in the direction west of Ocheretyne in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where the Russians are attacking multiple Ukrainian defensive positions. Starting out in direction of Vesele and along the railway, the Russians have advanced to advance alongside it and have advanced in the direction of Vesele. In this advance, the Russians have also gained a foothold in the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. The Ukrainians have lines of trenches and other fortified positions here, which they are using to defend against the Russian armed forces. The Russians have flanked that from moving along the southwest of Vovche here, capturing the fortified position to the east, and then moving along it to gain a foothold here to the south of the fortified position, attacking Vesele from the southern flank. This is to gain control over the village before moving on and flanking the Ukrainian fortified positions north of the village and starting an attack towards the western parts, while at the same time covering the flank to continue moving along the railroad. The Russian operation here is, as I had previously predicted, to move along the railroad all the way through to Pokrovsk, and in that moving to the sides and the flanks, capturing the villages alongside it and having a wider flank as they continue pushing, and at the same time moving the entirety of the front line from the south along Karelivka towards Selidove, and in the north from Ocheretyne along the northern side by the highway intersection between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka to the north. In this, we see that the Russians will likely have to continue pushing along Karelivka and advance in the southern flank to strengthen their current position, because we see that the Russian push in the north is advancing at a much faster rate than in the southern direction, which could slow down the northern advances because the southern part simply is not catching up. The Russians need to gain control over Selidove before they need or are able to move in the direction of Pokrovsk and advance towards the city. Further north of the recent advance along the railway, the Russians are also advancing towards Topographic and Lysychne, as the Russians are moving along the fortified position of the Ukrainians towards the northern and western directions. It is clear that the Russians are here moving along the fortified positions and trenches to capture the villages that are connected with these fortified positions, both in the direction of Ivanivka, Lysychne, and Timofivka. So the Russians are currently attacking all of these villages. The village of Topographic to the north, Lysychne to the northwest, Ivanivka to the west, Vesele to the southwest, and Shelane to the south, all of these along the front line to advance in a western direction. Taking a look at the topographic map, we can see the village of Progress here in the north at an elevation of 214 meters. To the north, it is about 200 meters, and going into the village itself, it is 180. By Ivanivske, it is 180. By Vesele, again, it is about 180. And down south, again, about 197. So this is at a high elevation. The closer it is to the railways, the higher elevation it is. The Russians are using that elevation to take advantage of their position and move along their fortified positions, gaining control over the ones at the heights before moving further south by going into the villages. As we can currently see along the front line, following the capture of Progress and Vovche, the Russians have yet to enter another village. They are currently moving along the railways and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the heights before they actually enter the villages. We see that with the concentration of Ukrainian fortified positions in the area, it is also difficult for the Russians to make any significant breakthrough. They're currently moving along the areas where there are fewer fortified positions to advance as much as possible to take advantage of the breakthrough through the first line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk direction. As the Russians reach Serivka and Shelane to the south, they will likely stop their advance along the railways and focus on gaining control over the villages that are along the front line, which they are looking to capture, and then move along the river line here to the south as well. This is to gain as much of an advantage as possible through this breakthrough, and then they'll attempt another one towards Mykolaiivka, which would be the next stop along the way to Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians do have a significant amount of soldiers and fortified positions in this area. However, due to the recent advance by the Russians and breakthrough of the Ukrainian defensive positions here near Progress, It is reported that a number of Ukrainian soldiers were lost, captured, and otherwise wounded during the last bit of fighting, so we can expect the Ukrainians sending additional reinforcements to this section of the front line to try and hold the line and prevent the Russians from breaking through even further the Ukrainian defensive positions. And as such, we'll likely see additional Ukrainian units being sent to this front line, which will weaken other sections of the front line, as the Ukrainians do not have a proper reserve fully trained and equipped right now. This means that the majority of forces that are being redirected come from the front line, and this is why there's no demobilization. And that is exactly why I say the Ukrainians have been close to collapse for quite a while now, and that is due to the fact that the worse that the Ukrainians do at the front line, the worse they will do. The current situation is that the longer the Ukrainians are struggling at the front line, the more casualties they take, the less weapons they receive from the West. All of these combined add up to the fact that the Ukrainians will continue to struggle to plug the gaps, and if they don't plug the gaps, then the Russians will just continue taking advantage of the situation. The better the Russians do at the front line at the different sections of it, the better they will continue to do, as the Ukrainians will be forced to redirect their forces, spread them out even thinner, and they will be losing their fortified positions in exchange for maybe less fortified positions. The further west they go, if the Russians capture the entire area here, south of Kostiantynivka, they'll have less fortified positions to actually use to defend their next positions. So we see the better the Russians do, the worse the Ukrainians do, it will continue spiraling in that direction. The Ukrainians need to switch something up right now, otherwise it will just continue as it is currently going and become worse and worse as time goes by until they finally collapse. In the direction of New York, the Russians have advanced slightly here to the west of the area towards Alexandropol and Panteleimonivka, where the villages here along the western parts are occupied by Ukrainian positions, where they are holding a western flank to New York towards the fortified position of the Ukrainians here facing directly southwards. That means if the Russians push here, gain control over these villages, they'll be able to flank the Ukrainian positions and strengthen their positions and hold on New York, isolating it from the rest of the Ukrainian positions. Therefore, the Ukrainians are holding onto these positions as a defensive line towards the east and to the south to prevent such a thing from happening, and the Russians are moving along the eastern parts towards these villages to develop their offensive operations further in this direction. The Ukrainian forces sent additional forces to New York as a part of their forces were still located in the east along the 2014 line of defense, and therefore they are forced to spread their forces thinner due to the wedge that is created by the Russian presence here inside of the city. So we see additional forces of the Ukrainians being sent to New York direction as well. In the Toretsk section of the front line, we see the Russians have advanced recently here along the fortified positions and the second line of defense as they close in on the Ukrainian positions there, capturing the residential area to the east of it. And we see that continuous fighting along the Toretsk and New York section of the front line are there. We see that the main focus of the Russians is here near Donetsk in the northern part, as there's been no significant developments in the south. However, we do still see that fighting continues in the direction of Kostiantynivka, where according to the latest report by the Ukrainian brigade standing for the defense of the town, have reported that an additional push by the Russians, this time with only 14 mechanized vehicles, launched again towards the town. In that assault, only 2 of them were damaged and 1 destroyed. While they claim that a lot of Russian infantry were killed, this is a development that means that the Russians did manage to reach the village and gain a foothold. It was also reported by multiple sources that the Russians have gained a foothold. So the Russians do now have a foothold within Kostiantynivka, and the Ukrainians are trying to prevent them from strengthening that by continuously launching these FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes on Russian positions. But the Russians have managed to gain a foothold, and as we see, the Russians, whenever they get a foothold, tend to end up taking control over the town, just like it did with Novomikhailivka. They'll also likely continue pushing along the southern parts, along the road, and towards the north as well, as they continue developing the operations here in the direction of Kostiantynivka. The town itself is a bit wider than Novomikhailivka, but also shorter. the distance between the east and the west is shorter, while the distance between the north and the south is longer. We see that it is likely that the Russians will spend quite a while to gain control over this, as it is a well-fortified position by the Ukrainians. It's also a well-prioritized position, as it connects the northern parts of the area by Volodar with Volodar itself. Gaining control of Kostiantynivka will significantly strengthen the Russian positions in the direction of Volodar and limit the supplies the Ukrainians are able to send to the town. Therefore, it is clear that the fighting here by Kostiantynivka will be very tough, and it will continue for quite a while, but it is a position now where the Russians have gained a foothold in the eastern parts of it, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to their positions and prevent the Russians from strengthening their positions, and are actually attempting to push them out of it again. That is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.